Well, good morning, church. Well, 8 weeks, it's a long time. And let me just say that I missed most of you. So if you're new, I have just done what is called a sabbatical, and if you're unfamiliar with that word, you're not alone. I talked to a friend last week who I hadn't talked to in a long time, and when I said the word, he replied back, "Sabbata what?" It's hard for some people to understand. In fact, Jamie Scott sent me this Facebook message in the middle of my sabbatical. So this week, someone from a different congregation had heard about your time off. They thought it was cool that you were able to do that. I may have accidentally referred to it as your suspension instead of your sabbatical. Those are the same, right? So you're not alone if you're not exactly sure what a sabbatical is. A sabbatical is simply an extended time away for refreshment, hoping to achieve longevity for the ministers that work at this church. The elders just approved this last year, and so once a decade, if a minister works here a decade, they get a sabbatical, and I really enjoyed mine. The number one question people have asked me is, what did you do during your sabbatical? If you looked at Andy's email last week, he asked many people that question last week, and let me say that Andy put up a video 8 weeks ago, which was very misleading. If you were here 2 months ago, he showed you a video with a still that you can see behind me of me with a megaphone yelling the word sabbatical in people's ears. This is all Andy's idea. That is not what I did on my sabbatical. So just to give you a glimpse of what I did do on my sabbatical, here's a few pictures. I attended a wedding. If you look at that one closely, the preacher at this wedding, really, he didn't know what he was doing and needed some help, and so he really asked for my guidance to make that sermon a little bit better, if you heard that sermon. If you've been following the NBA playoffs, you'll know that LeBron's been doing pretty well. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason. Him and I have had some really good talks. I've really helped him turn the corner on what was really becoming just kind of a lackluster career, so you can thank that, you can attribute that to me. And then I know many of you have been praying for our country, and your prayers have been answered. I was able to spend some time with President Trump. Okay, you can get that one off the screen. I don't want to make people's blood pressure go up here. So what I actually did on my sabbatical, to keep it brief, is I spent a lot of time with family. I spent a lot of time reading. I probably read more in the last 2 months than I have since I was in grad school. I went on several trips. I spent some extended time in solitude, just praying and fasting. And over the next few months, I'm sure I'll be able to tell you about some of these insights and experiences. But as I get going again, I do want to say thanks. First of all, a big thank you to the elders for approving the policy about a year ago, and for thinking about the longevity of their ministers here at Memorial Road. And then also a big thanks for all the ministers that spoke in my place. Scott mentioned these, but I'm so thankful that the pulpit was filled with such capable and qualified men. So thank you to Andy and Mitch and Brian and Jeff, Harold and Josh and Jay and Dean and Dwayne for taking my place in my absence. And then I also want to say a thank you to the church. 1 month into my sabbatical, my grandpa passed away, and I entered back into church world for a few days for the funeral, and I just wanted to tell you that I felt so much love in that few days when I was at the funeral and just talking to people, and many of you sent cards and text messages and got on Facebook to send encouraging notes, and thank you so much for that. On behalf of myself and my whole family, we just felt a lot of love from this church family, so thank you very much for that. The point of a sabbatical is longevity, and I feel refreshed, and I hope I can do this for a really long time. One of the great fruits of my sabbatical was just remembering how great a church family this is. The Memorial Road Church of Christ is a fantastic church family, and if you've been here for a long time, you're part of the reason it's such a great family. If you haven't been here a long time, if you're new to this church family, then I hope you'll plant and make roots here. This is a great place, and I plan to stay here a long time. This is a great place to make friends, to find meaning, and to know Christ. And so I sure hope that you'll stay for a while. Okay, how about a sermon? Now, I got to qualify this. There's a lot of expectations the first sermon after a sabbatical. I did not spend all the last 8 weeks preparing this one sermon. So if your expectation level is up here, you might want to lower it down just a little bit. I'm starting a new series today called Summer in the Psalms. We're going to spend the next few weeks just looking at different psalms, and there's a few reasons for this. One reason is in the fall we're going to launch into a whole school year theme called The Refuge, Resting in God's Presence. And that theme will be filled with a lot of talk about in sermons about prayer and rest and Sabbath and recalibration. And so this summer I want to lay a foundation of being in the Psalms and learning the language of God as we anticipate that coming theme. Secondly, one of the reasons I want to spend some time in the Psalms is that when I personally lose words, when I don't know what to say when I pray, I'll often go to the Psalms. I'll pull a psalm out and I'll pray through the psalm, and that actually helps me recultivate the language of prayer. And so that's one of the reasons I want to spend time in the Psalms. And then a third reason is simply that there are some fantastic lessons that you can learn when you study the Psalms. And so we're going to begin today with Psalm 84. And as Josh did last week, I want to do the same thing. I'd like you to stand up as we read through most of the verses in this psalm. And when we get to verse 10, I want you to read verse 10 with me. So if you'll please stand. The psalmist writes these words, "How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. They go from strength to strength till each appears before God in Zion." And read this last line with me. "Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked." You can be seated. There's two fascinating things about this psalm I want to share with you. The first one is this. It's not just what he wrote, which is an incredible laud to the wonder and beauty of God, but the amazing thing is where he wrote it. Scholars think that the author of this psalm was in Assyrian captivity when he wrote it. And so that means that this guy was not in Jerusalem, he's not in the temple, he's not with the people of God, and yet he's writing this psalm which is full of lofty language. He uses language like, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O God Almighty, and I wish I could be with you, God." Well, he's not in Jerusalem. In fact, scholars think that this guy used to be a doorkeeper at the temple, which basically means he was the Walmart greeter of the temple. And so when people would come in with their sacrifices, he would make sure they had the right sacrifices, and he would just stand at the door all day long. So his day job was being at the place where everybody in the world wanted to be. This was the house of God. And so what this psalm is it's his longing to be back where he once was. It's amazing that he can write these words from such a place of despair. It makes me wonder, how do you do that? If you really think about it, this should be a psalm of lament. He should be saying, "Why am I not back in Jerusalem? And why did you let Sennacherib come in and destroy the temple?" How can you be in such a place of despair and yet write these kind of words? Second thing to note in this psalm is that the author writes about himself in third person in the middle of the psalm. But you really have to pay attention to find it. So verse 5, he says, "Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage." We don't use that word a lot today, pilgrimage. It simply means a journey with a clear destination. So lots of people go on pilgrimages. And the psalmist himself is on a pilgrimage. He wants to be back in Jerusalem. He wants to be back in the temple. So he is on a journey. He's writing the psalm about himself. Now the next verse is where things get really interesting. Verse 6 says, "As they passed through the valley of Baca." This is the only time in the whole Bible that the phrase "valley of Baca" is used. In the Hebrew, it just means place of desolation, the place of weeping. So this is a really bad place. And so in your mind, when they say Valley of Baca, you might think like Death Valley, like desert. Like if you were in this place, you would want water, you would be crippled by the blistering heat, you would be trying to get out of the way of snakes, it would be difficult to survive. If you were in the Valley of Baca, you would do everything possible to get out of the Valley of Baca. In fact, a few weeks ago, as part of my sabbatical, I took Mary to the Grand Canyon. And at the top of the Grand Canyon, they have this sign that is meant to scare people from going into the Grand Canyon without water. It's not a great sign, and I'll show you a picture of it. It's just this guy vomiting. And so at the beginning of your trek, you're ready to see all these amazing views of this wonderful place God created, and that's what it starts off with, this weird picture of a man vomiting. If there could be a sign in the Valley of Baca, it would be this sign: don't go there, get out. You can get that ugly sign off the screen. Now here's what's fascinating. The very next line, as they pass through the Valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. What a strange turn. That's not how the psalm should flow naturally. You would think the next words would be something like, as they passed through the Valley of Baca, they were overwhelmed by drought, or they are weakened by the heat. And yet the psalmist says that this person talking about himself is going through the driest, most desolate, most depressing place there could possibly be, and springs of water are coming from the desert. You see, this psalm makes us realize that it is possible for a person to change a place. That's exactly what the psalmist is doing as he's sitting in Assyria. His body is in despair, but his mind is in delight. And I say all this to bring up a battle that you and I face every single day. It's a very simple battle, and it's this: there's always a battle between your attitude and your environment. It's always going on. The battle between what's going on in your context and your setting and your surrounding, and then what's going on in your mind and in your heart. Think about it. Every single room or building or workspace or social circle has its own environment before you even show up. So maybe your office environment is really competitive. Maybe the culture has a value system which says, look out for number one. Maybe lying and cheating and doing anything to get ahead are normal in your work environment. That's the culture. Maybe the environment for your family is that of anxiety. Like before you even show up, there's just tension in your family. Maybe past arguments still linger just beneath the surface. Maybe the environment of your social group is just constant pessimism. Maybe everybody's always making fun of each other, or maybe it's really high on vulgarity. Maybe environment makes you feel inferior every time you enter that room or every time you enter that social circle. And so anytime you engage an environment, one of two things happen. Number one, you acquiesce to the environment, so that whatever is going on in the culture, whether it be anger or pessimism or greed, that then becomes you and your attitude. Or the second thing that can happen is that you overcome the environment, and your attitude is not shaped by the environment in which you find yourself in, just like the psalmist who finds himself in Assyria. I'll give you two examples of this tension between environment and attitude. The first one is a Bible story most of you are probably familiar with. 13-year-old David approaches the battle lines where his brothers and the army of Israel stand waiting to face Goliath. Goliath is coming down every day and taunting Israel. What do you think the environment is like on the front lines? It's probably pretty tense. I can see a lot of people walking around with their arms folded and their heads down. I can see a lot of tense whispering back and forth. I can see a lot of blaming each other. It's a toxic environment. And what happens when David comes in? Does the environment overtake his attitude, or does his attitude overtake the environment? Well, if you remember the story, little 13-year-old David comes bounding down the hill just like Goldilocks, and he enters into this battlefield, and he looks at Goliath, and he says, oh, well, they've got Goliath, well, we've got God. We're fine. And somehow, little David is able to take his attitude and change his environment. Here's another example from my life. A few weeks ago, and we decided to take a helicopter ride as the big climax of the anniversary trip. We saved it to the last day of the trip because we knew that it would be the best memory of the trip. And so here we are, we're so excited, well, I found a way to ruin the experience other than rapidly. You really couldn't hear anything, and there was another couple with us, a couple from Boston. In the passenger part of the helicopter. They sat them first, then they sat me down, and so I took my chair, and I'm so excited to be sitting with my wife, and then they closed the door, and they put Mary in the front seat, right next to the pilot. And then the helicopter takes off. We don't even get to speak to each other, and all my mind is thinking about is, Mary has this panoramic view of the entire Grand Canyon, and go back, you put the demon picture up too fast. So Mary has this panoramic view of the entire Grand Canyon, and I had this battle going on in my mind between my environment and my attitude. And so the environment was an environment of envy. Like, surely I've been a Christian a long time. I'm not going to let this affect me. Surely I'm going to overcome this. But I got to tell you, after about one round in the boxing ring, the environment definitely TKO'd my attitude. So much so that we got out of the helicopter, and Mary was like, well, how did you enjoy it? And I was like, it's fine. It's okay. It's a helicopter ride over the Grand Canyon. Like, you would think that I'd be mature enough to handle that. And so now you can show the demon picture. The light was just hitting my face a certain way. Don't know how it happened, but this reflects what was going on in my heart. I was not close to God at all. Okay, now you can take that off the screen. So in that case, I acquiesce to my environment. Now, my guess is that you want to be the kind of person like young David. You want to be the kind of person like the psalmist, who when you get in the middle of a toxic environment, whether that be your family or your work environment or traffic or whatever environment in your life is toxic, my guess is you want to be the kind of person who has an attitude that's so strong that you can actually overcome your environment instead of allowing your environment to overcome you. You want to be the type of person that can choose faith over fear, or can choose love over hate, or can choose to be joyful even if you're in a sorrowful environment. But my guess is also that, like me, you don't know exactly how to get there. I want you to look back at the psalm, because I think Psalm 84 lays the blueprint for how you become the type of person that influences your environment rather than the other way around. Here's how the psalm begins. How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints. When was the last time you fainted for something? When was the last time you wanted something so bad that you fainted? My soul yearns, it even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh, they cry out for the living God. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. You ever prayed like that? And what a line. Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. I mean, the reality is that Assyria is quite a bit more beautiful than Israel. They've got gardens and rivers and covered colonnades and state-of-the-art buildings, and this author is sitting in one of the most remarkable places at the time on the whole planet. But what he's praying and what he's saying to God is, you know what? I'd trade it all for one day. I'd trade 1,000 days of the greatest vacation in the world just for one day. Just one day to be back in your presence. You know, my guess is that exile did not break him. And I think it has everything to do with what he wanted. So here's the point. Here's the truth. Your longing shapes your living. The thing that you want the most, the thing that you spend all your time thinking about, and the thing that you crave more than anything else in the world, that's going to dictate what you do on a day-to-day basis. And so if good health is what you want more than anything else in the world, think about it. That's what you're going to spend your time doing and moving towards. If good health, if it's good health, if that's your chief desire, then most of your days are going to be spent exercising and thinking about your diet because you want good health. Or if your ultimate aim is good relationships, then you're going to spend most of your time talking to your friends, being with your friends, trying to spend time with family, trying to create meaningful experiences if relationships are at the top of your desire list. Or if video games or Netflix, if that's the top of your want list, then guess what? You're going to spend all your waking hours doing that thing because your longing shapes your living. You see, the reason that some of us are overwhelmed by the deserts of life is because we are longing for something that is not lasting. I'm going to say that again. The reason that some of us are overwhelmed by the deserts of life, the valley of Bacchus in our own life, is because we're longing for something that's not lasting. We're yearning for things that are temporary. Now, they might be good things. Health is good. Friendships are good. Respect is good. But they're not God. See, if your deepest longing in life is anything but God himself, the person of God, the presence of God, the resurrection that God offers, if your deepest longings are anything other than God himself, you will always find yourself overwhelmed by the deserts of life. It's because your longing shapes your living. How do you think it's possible that Paul and Silas could sing in the middle of a jail? It's not because they had good voices. It's not because they're bored. It's because more than anything else in the world, they wanted Christ. That's what Paul says in Philippians. I want to know Christ. And if that's his ultimate longing, then guess what? He turns a prison into a glee club. Your longing shapes your living. One of the most moving experiences for me during my sabbatical was reading the final sermon that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ever preached. It was April 3rd, it was 1968. There were rumors that some people might be threatening to take his life. In fact, the rumors had reached the point that Dr. King's closest friends and family were encouraging him to back out of the spotlight for just a few weeks because there seemed to be some imminent threats. But Dr. King told them, I have to keep pressing forward. I have to keep marching. I have to keep protesting. I have to keep preaching. And so he stood up. He didn't know it at the time, but this would be his final sermon. I want to read you two excerpts. The first one I'm going to read you is actually the way he ended the sermon. So here's the final words from Dr. King's final sermon. He says, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I have seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It's pretty incredible. Think about the environment that he was in the moment he delivered this amazing message. His environment was toxic. He was living in this racial tension that we can't even fathom. today. He was living in an environment of violence and of fear. And yet he could stand up in a pulpit and declare with all authority, I'm not worried. I'm not afraid. I'm fearless. Now, how in the world is that possible? Well, his speech, it says it all so clearly. What Dr. King had figured out how to do in the final days of his life was very simple. He had clarified his longing. If you'll notice in the speech, he talks about happiness. That's not what he wants the most. He even talks about longevity of life, but that's not what he wants the most. He'd figured it out. The one thing that he wanted more than anything else was the promised land. It's the same thing the psalmist wanted. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. His longing shaped his living. That's how Dr. King could deliver such a powerful message, and that's how he could inspire such a powerful movement. So what do you want the most? I want to answer one final question that some of you are probably thinking. Some of you are probably thinking something like this. Okay, Phil, I agree. My chief desire should be God. I want to want God. But how do you increase desire? Like, Phil, if you were telling me to become a better fisherman, I could just take a fishing class. Or if you're telling me to be a better cook, I could just take a cooking class. But what you're saying is that you want me to desire God more? That's abstract. Is it even possible to want something more? I think the answer is yes. And let me explain why. If you're a teenager or older, it's what some people are coining as a new phrase, which I read, infotainment. And what infotainment is, it's when we go to our device with no other reason but to scroll mindlessly through news feeds and articles, and one click leads to another click, and we just find ourselves taking in information as entertainment over and over again, really with no point to it. I want this now. It's our desire for this is really high. In fact, over the next 6-7 hours, you're probably going to get to a point this afternoon where you're sitting at home and you're bored and you have nothing to do, and you're going to reach for your phone and you just start scrolling. It's a high desire that many, many people have. Now, here's my question. 15, 20 years ago, before there were cell phones, before there were smartphones, did you have that desire? Of course you didn't. There weren't smartphones. So where does that desire even come from then? I read Christianity Today's Book of the Year from 2017, and the author of that book nailed it. When she had this one brilliant line, she simply said, "Habits shape our desires." In other words, what you do the most shapes what you want the most. What you do the most shapes what you want the most. And so the reason here in a few hours you're going to grab your phone is because you're in the habit of doing that. And because you've built that habit hundreds and hundreds of times, now you want it. This is the same with entertainment. For those of you that love ESPN, or for those of you that love Fox News, the reason you love it so much is because of habit. Once you do something over and over and over and over and over again, your desire for that thing increases. It's the same with food. Think about your favorite new dessert over the last few years. A dessert that you didn't want maybe 5 years ago. Why do you want it so bad right now? Whether it's a candy or a cake or a cookie. Habit. Habits shape desires. What you do the most shapes what you want the most. It's that way with technology. It's that way with that entertainment. It's that way with food. But here's the good news. It's also that way with God. What this means is it is possible to increase your desire for God. And I'll give you the easiest way to do that. Back to the Psalm, verse 4. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever, say this next word with me, they are ever praising you. Singing is much more than the production of a melody. Singing is actually the cultivation of desire. Do not underestimate the power of song in teaching you how to want. In fact, if you go back and read the superscript of Psalm 84, it says, "For the director of music," meaning that the psalm was not just meant to be said, the psalm was meant to be sung. And so what that also means is that this psalmist sitting in Assyria, sitting in exile, he's not just thinking his way out of despair, he is singing his way out of despair. I want to read you one final section from Dr. King's final sermon. At this point in his sermon, he is reminding people of the past in order to give them courage. And he's reminding them of this story, which needs a little bit of background. He references a guy named Bull Connor. And Bull Connor was a politician. He was a white supremacist. In many ways, he was the face of racism during the civil rights movement. And so here's what Dr. King said at another point in his sermon. He said, "I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, when we were in that majestic struggle. There we would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By the hundreds we would move out. And Bull Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth, and they did come out. But we just went on before the dogs, say it with me, before the dogs, singing. Ain't gonna let no one turn me around." And Bull Connor next would say, "Turn the fire hoses on." But Bull Connor did not know history. He knew of a kind of physics. I love this part. He knew of a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the transphysics, something bigger and greater than what you can just see in your everyday surroundings. That couldn't stop us. And we just went on before the dogs, and we'd look at them, and we'd go on before the water hoses, and we'd look at it, and we'd just go on singing. Over my head, I see freedom in the air. And we'd be thrown in the paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stacked in like sardines in a can, and we'd just go on in the paddy wagons singing, "We shall overcome." And every now and then we'd go to jail, and we'd see the jailers looking through the windows, being moved by our prayers, being moved by our words and our songs. And there was a power there which Bill Connor could not adjust to. It was the power of song. You see, there's something that happens when we sing together, and it's not just that we grow closer to each other, though that is true. Singing definitely strengthens our bonds. But more importantly, singing strengthens our desire. You see, Jesus taught us how to pray, but singing teaches us how to want. And so how do you make springs in the desert? Well, it all begins with your longing. And that's what Dr. King figured out. Even though he was in the valley of Baca, even though he was in the worst desert of his life, even though he was in prison, he did not let the place destroy the person. No, for him, the person destroyed the place. And how did he do it? How did Dr. King figure out how to do that? It was all about his longing. You see, Dr. King wasn't just longing to get out of jail. He wasn't just longing for racial reconciliation. He wasn't just longing for equality, though obviously he was longing for all those things. But deep down, when you read his words carefully, Dr. King was longing for nothing less than God himself. And the longing is what kept him living. And do you know how he kept the longing alive? One note at a time. You see, longing shapes your living, but guess what? Your singing shapes your longing. And so keep singing, because every single note matters. The more you sing, the more you yearn. And the more you praise, the more you crave. So here's two things to do. Number one, if you want to want God more, I would encourage you this coming Wednesday to come to WOW. We've been doing this for years. Scott does an incredible job. We spend Wednesdays, many of us, just worshiping, just singing to God. And so if you find yourself low on the desire level, one thing you can do is just come start worshiping with us on Wednesdays. The theme is Know, K-N-O-W, and we're singing about what it means to know God. But here's number 2, it's something you can do. Don't waste a song. Every song counts. As you come here every single week, many of you have been doing this for decades. And you've sang these songs thousands of times. Half the time you don't even think about what you're singing because it's so familiar, but just remember, it all matters. Every time we get together, every psalm, every hymn, the new ones, the old ones, every It Is Well, every Amazing Grace, every Oh Praise the Name increases little by little our desire for God. And if you want to get through the deserts of life, and if you want to make your valley of Baca into a place of springs, it all starts with your longing. And your longing starts with your singing. And so we're about to sing. And while we sing this song, hopefully with all our hearts and our spirits, if there's something going on in your life, maybe I didn't even preach about it, but there's just something hanging in your heart, and you want to get it off your chest, let me tell you, this church is a praying church. This church is a loving church. This church is a baptizing church. We love people, and we want to help people take the next step in their relationship with Jesus Christ. So if there's anything that you need, you can come tell me about it. And if you're going to stay where you are, then I encourage you to sing this next song like you really mean it, because it matters. Our singing shapes our longing. Let's stand and let's sing.